Welcome to this episode of Talking Transformation, an Australian Transformation and Turnaround Association initiative. We hope you enjoy the varied conversations and experiences shared by our industry transformation and turnaround leaders. If you'd like to know more about AusTTA, you can visit our website at austtta.org. I'm the series host, Jackie O'Dowd. Welcome to this episode of Talking Transformation. Today, I'm talking with Hakon, who is the co-founder and CEO of VorteXplore, which is a UK-based company. Hakon has a PhD in, of all things, behavioural economics, and he spent 20 years as a senior manager at an international bank. So no doubt he needed that PhD. And for the last 4 years, he's been working with his team to build some amazing technology and approaches in using behavioural science and some of that PhD in economics to work on how organisations can be better places for us all to work. So Hakon, welcome.
Well, thanks, Jackie, and thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Now, you and your team have been developing some really innovative ways now of listening to what's happening in organisations. So can you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing and why it's so useful?
Yeah, this is a lot about coming to grips with changes and challenges companies have around diversity or inclusion or specific behavioral challenges. And I think the biggest challenge there is that we're not really measuring these challenges properly. And I think the problem is that you cannot manage what you cannot measure. That's the core of what we are doing. So as an example, perhaps let's start with diversity. Diversity as a measurement is backwards looking, and it's difficult to see any progress if you look backwards instead of forwards. And I think the main problem we see here is that a lot of companies struggling with diversity have seen that their employees have voted by their feet long before they see the numbers. We believe inclusion is a much more powerful concept. And in essence, that is about, I guess, how someone feels. And traditional surveys that you would normally use don't really measure that. So this is about listening. This is about trying to understand what employees, what we call it, lived experience is. And employees are engaged in interactions every day, hundreds of interactions. And a number of these interactions shape how they feel about your company. And how they feel about the company is going to determine if you're able to retain them or if they are engaged or if they want to help the company be successful. So it's very important in our view to listen and try to understand what all these interactions actually result in terms of how people feel about your company. And that's the core thing what we do.
Yeah. And it's really interesting when we're working on transformation or turnaround projects, you know, getting insight into as many aspects of the business is really important. So how can transformation and turnaround leaders, you know, use those insights to make some change?
So in terms of how they achieve the insights or in terms of how they use the insights?
Achieve the insights. How do they gain the insight that they need to make effective change? And then how can they use them to get fast, effective results?
So let's talk first about how they gain those insights, because I think that is actually a much larger challenge than most of us realize. Most companies will use surveys to gain insights. They will basically ask questions. There is no coincidence that we have the term survey fatigue. Surveys are really unloved, right? And employees do not respond well to surveys. And in many ways, it's very difficult to trust the results from surveys. You know, employees will tend to hold emotions back. They will tend to give the answers that they think you want. They will tend to paint a picture of themselves and the company that doesn't really reflect what you want, and what you want to see, and the truth you are listening, trying to find out. And I think what we're seeing is that a lot of these real emotions and the real concerns employees have are now being outsourced to outside providers, for instance, Glassdoor or Fishbowl, where employees are painting a very different picture of your company than they will give you in internal surveys. And a lot of the surveys we use today are based on behavioral science that is old technology, 20 years old and more. Because a lot of the questions we ask are relating to objectives and ways that employees feel about the company that might have been prevalent 20 years ago, but certainly is not coinciding with the new ways of working and the new way employees would like to see their company today. So I think the first thing we need to change is the way we listen to employees, and we need to enhance and change and improve the way we ask those questions. So it comes really down to your ability to listen and your ability to understand what the emotional connection is with the company. To the second part of your question around what will the results tell us? I think the results will always tell us something that relates back to what we are looking for in our employees and what is becoming key in the new ways of working. And there are a number of new ways that employees can add value that is just becoming a lot more important now than it was before. And I think we can talk about a number of things like active learning, critical thinking, ability to analyze problem and solve problems in a much more active way than we were thinking about before. And it will become much more central to our ability to innovate and be agile in a company. But all of these things I just mentioned, learning, analysis, problem solving, are hugely dependent on your ability to build a culture that actually accommodates that. You need a strong community, you need team and organizational connectivity and a sense of belonging for people to feel comfortable and safe to introduce new ideas, to be able to take criticism constructively about the ideas they're hearing about, and actually actively start to learn things. Any learning and development process in a company is requiring a safe space to be effective. So I think what we're seeing is that the way that employees are acting within the company is changing as well.
And there seems to be an increasing focus now on things like psychological safety in organizations, isn't there?
Yes, and we see very clearly, and it's also in all surveys, that the results of insufficient leadership, insufficient interaction with your employees, it can be autocratic leadership styles, it can be inability to listen to those emotions and listen to your employees, also in smaller teams and perhaps also even in different parts of the organization. They lead to reactions, and ultimately they lead to valuable employees leaving. So I think it's very key that we have a much stronger focus on leadership and the ability to listen at all levels of the organization today.
So you mentioned the new way of working, especially since the pandemic hit, where people can work somewhere or they can work anywhere. In that mode of working, and as in the work that you've been doing, are you seeing that things like inclusion is getting better or worse? And how that mode of working changes the team dynamic?
Yes, I think all the challenges we had 3 years ago in teams, in the way teams work together, these challenges haven't gone away. People interacting with each other in an organization will always have the same challenges. And the pandemic and remote working hasn't changed that. But I think the concerning thing is, in many ways, it's found other ways and in other forms, and it's manifesting itself in other ways now. And I think a lot of the things we've seen during the pandemic has aggravated the challenge of inclusion.
Yeah.
And there might be very small things. Most remote working apps have commentary fields. Zoom, for instance, has a way you can send comments to other participants or all participants in the meeting. And what we're seeing very often is that the employees are complaining about the in-out dynamics created by being in a meeting and not knowing what comments people are making about you during a presentation, for instance. And this can lead to a very strong polarization within the meeting. So I think there are ways today to go behind people's backs that weren't there before.
So when we're working from home, when we're working either somewhere or anywhere, does that have an impact on inclusion? And it's certainly now starting to have an impact on privacy, isn't it?
Yes. And effectively, we are entering people's bedrooms or people's closets or people's living rooms. And those rooms reflect your life, right? Your private life, and your private and your professional lives gets mixed up. And some people will tend to interpret social status into how you live. So you cannot protect that anymore. And I think that is taking away one of the safe spaces we had in the way we interacted also within the company. And I think that is a concern. I also think that we are uncovering, and perhaps in an unwanted ways, a lot more challenges around mental health and how people go about their mental health problems. Yeah. Because it's much more difficult to protect yourself against scrutiny on your mental health problem if you are available, if you have much more availability during video conferencing or remote working situation. Yeah. And I also think that people's domestic tasks have changed. We know that women are spending a lot more time with domestic duties now than it did before the pandemic, especially during the lockdowns, but we don't know how much of that will linger going forward. And I think people are taking on new roles that are challenging to the type of availability that you're seeing now. So I think that the remote working situation has changed a lot, the way that people interact, but it hasn't taken away the challenges you see around behavior, diversity, and inclusion.
No, it doesn't. But organizations need to adapt as well, don't they? I mean, there's a lot of adaptation by the individual, but as organizations, we need to factor in all of those changes. So getting views of those changes and how people actually feel is becoming more and more critical. Now, that's one of the things that fascinated me about what you're doing and the VX approach, or VorteXplore approach to surveying and deep listening. So tell us a little bit more about what you're doing in order to give organizations and individuals that greater level of insight that helps them overcome some of those things.
Yeah, sure. So I think there is two big things in what we're doing. Is what you said, the deep listening. So the ability to understand what the root causes are and what really drives people's feeling about the company they work for. And as you said, right, especially during transformational changes in your company, you need to be a lot more acutely aware of what is happening and how you can bring your employees along with you on the journey that you're taking. I also think there is a question of how do you scale this? It's very difficult to understand employees through the tools you have today. But if you had time to talk to someone for a longer period of time, a proper interview about someone's emotions done properly through an HR professional will take almost an hour. Most companies do not have those resources. So I think it's a combination of being able to conduct deep listening, but you will need to do it at scale to understand what really drives employees. And that's what we are addressing. I think the first thing is around creating a safe space in the way you ask questions. We are using short videos to do that. We're seeing that it generates a much stronger and more confidential relationship when you show a video and ask people's views as a bystander. I think you need to ask people's personal opinion as well. It's not about what they expect the company to think, but what they think themselves, because ultimately what they think themselves will determine how they feel about the company. And we are using AI and we are using ways to scale this so that you can run that survey for multiple thousand people at the same time. And then, of course, get a much more detailed map around what's happening in your company, and especially during transformative processes. I think the last point I wanted to make is it's important that you create a baseline, that you have a understanding of where your employees were before the process started, and then understand how you're stressing employees during the process in order to understand, are you going too fast? Could you go faster? And also understand where to take particular care when you see effects in the way your employees react that perhaps were unwanted.
In the work that I do with organizations on various aspects of optimization and transformation, one of the observations I made a long time ago was in regards to business processes. You know, we always look at business processes as dictating or stipulating the activities that happen within a business and the timing of those activities. But I think one of the things that people often overlook is the fact that the way we design and implement processes impact how people behave and also impacts emotion. You know, if things are done well and there's no frustration, they don't cause anger, they don't cause upset or frustration, then that's all great. But in the real world, all of those things happen in an organization. So do you think we need to pay more attention to how processes are designed around behavior and emotion?
Absolutely. And I also think we need to listen. And I think we need to listen in a way that's different from what we often do today. I think as a process specialist, you will have seen this as well, Jackie, that you will feel that some of these reactions are irrational or they're emotional or they're not founded in science or data. But I think what we're seeing if you start listening is that these emotions and these reactions are just as valid as something that's been thought through in detail. People react emotionally for change. People will feel nervous about change. And I think it's important we have an ability to understand and listen to these emotions and deal with them. I think it takes, a different type of listening, a different type of skill set to understand them. But I think it's very much worth to take employees with you on that journey and show that you can create a safe space that you're able to listen, which often is a challenge, as you will know, but also that you're able to understand what causes these emotions and what things can you change in the way you run the process and the transformation in order to make employees feel more comfortable with it. But I think very often we would tend to disregard what we would see as emotional reactions, and we would prescribe that as an employee not being mature enough to deal with it. But I actually think going forward, we should listen a lot more to that.
Behavioral change in any organization is hard. And, like I said, I've always found that processes and communication, good communication, try to, solve some of those behavioral issues and some of those emotional issues. But one of the key things is how people actually interact is really important to generate and drive change. So we can do that through processes, and we can do that just by the way teams are structured. And, God knows how many agile teams there are now. And so, the old hierarchies of old have disappeared to be more team-based, and organizations have become more team-based. So as the time pressures start to hit, as the different teams have different ways of working, getting to understand how people react and respond is really important as well. So driving that whole change focus, I think, is really complex. And anybody who does this on a regular basis will get to see that every day. So how do we make life easier on the behavioral front? Is there a way?
Well, that's the holy grail in many ways, isn't it? But what we do see, though, is that we are talking a lot about how individuals feel. We are testing individuals. We are asking individuals. But very often we're leaving the team dynamics out of all of this. And there's a lot of things, especially in behavioral science, about team dynamics that very much influences the way that you feel about the place you work and your confidence in the company you work for. You can look at biases. Someone with a bias, a racist bias or a bias against women, that bias will be a personal thing, but it will have an impact of everyone in the team because they will experience this. Even those that are not directly affected will still feel that a bias might affect them in the future. And also dynamics around being able to raise concerns, being able to understand how other people feel, I think is absolutely central to the way that we are motivating employees and making employees feel comfortable. Our software very much looks at that, and our analytical model very much looks at that to understand where do we have concern around team dynamics, because you can have the best individuals in the world, but if the team dynamics doesn't work, as I mentioned earlier, I think there's a lot of things in the way that companies need to become agile that's not going to work as well. So I think it's very important to measure and understand the team unit as well. Perhaps just a quick additional comment to that. Team units change all the time, and people have very different ways to work in a modern company. So I think it's very important that we also have ways to understand how people work in the different team constellations that they find themselves in as well.
Yeah, the old hierarchy is irrelevant really these days, except maybe for some reporting lines. But the whole dynamics of, you can be an individual in an organization can be on 10 different teams, 10 different outcomes. So one of the things that I found fascinating, some of the research that you did, was that if you build this inclusive culture, whether that's at a team level, a divisional level, or an organizational level, that the teams are twice as likely to exceed their financial and performance targets. And they're 6 times more likely to be more innovative and agile. Did those results surprise you?
No, not at all. And I think anyone thinking about this will see why this is so incredibly important. If you look at things that are crucial for driving innovation is a pretty difficult thing to do, and it takes a certain amount of vulnerability to be able to come out with an idea and have that idea viewed at in a critical way. And if you're not able to create teams that can deal with this and teams that can listen to and absorb different types of ideas, I think we are already doing us a disfavor around our ability to innovate as a company. But I think what is often overlooked is the hard work you need to do within your teams, and by creating inclusivity and diversity and creating a safe space to enable those processes. And I think a lot of companies are running big transformational processes without thinking about that concept, as you're saying as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing a lot. Obviously, I work in that optimization and transformation space, but what I'm seeing is a lot of stressed teams. Like we said before, the team numbers are increasing, the number of team roles that people are trying to fulfill is getting larger. Plus, the hybrid way of working doesn't help either when everything is being done via Zoom meetings or team meetings or something else. One of the things that I'm seeing in particular is a lack, due to the increasing stress and pressure, time pressures, there's not enough time for creative thinking, really inclusive decision making. And all of that's resulting in a totally lack of creativity. And if we don't have that creative time, where does innovation come from? It's coming from better ways of being and doing. So I just think right now organizations have got an awful lot facing them if they're going to use effective teams, get alignment, better culture, sustainable performance. They need to do something different, because what's taken them and given them success in the past is not going to do it in the future.
Yes, and I think we both spoke about this a bit earlier in our conversation. Creating strong communities and having a team and an organizational connectivity and a sense of belonging. And we see that with clients we talk to as well. This is becoming more and more important. And I think it's one of the things that have really been impacted during the pandemic and is impacted from remote working. It's difficult to build strong teams and strong communities and a sense of belonging if you are remote. And I think that will be one of the drivers and one of the things managers will need to balance out with employees wanting to continue to work predominantly from home, that you will need to create these opportunities for teams to connect and work together. Because as I said earlier, I think a lot of the personal qualifications and the personal ability that you have can only be brought to fore within a team setting.
In the technology and the approach that you're using to help give us better insight into how individuals behave and react and respond, how teams do and how organizations do. I think, you know, the technology that you've got, the approach that you've taken is amazing and can be particularly useful for leaders of transformation and particularly turnaround as well. So tell us a little bit more about the technology and the approach that you're using and why it's just a little bit different to what's out there now.
Sure. So I think the first thing I mentioned was that we're using videos, which gives us a very different set of data. And the key thing with the videos is that people will watch the video and they will become bystanders to the situation they're seeing. And that allows them to be a lot more objective around the situation. And the second thing we do is we ask them their opinion about that situation they just viewed. And there are three different questions. The first question will be around how they felt personally about it. So you get a personal view. You basically get the employee value proposition. The second question is around, have they observed something similar in the organization they work in? And the third question is, would they feel comfortable escalating such a situation if they saw it? What it does is that it creates a much more differentiated view around what people feel, which is key to how they feel able to identify with the company, to what they have observed in the company. So you will much more easily identify areas of concern. And the last thing, of course, which is a real red flag, is if they do see a serious situation, they're not feeling able to escalate it. It is something that you probably would want to look into in more detail around how to create that confidence to be able to do so. Now, doing this on a large scale will generate a lot of data. And data is pretty worthless if you don't have a model behind it. So any situation we show, any video we show is based on an event that has a root cause. You will see people in a video being interrupted pretty frequently. The root cause might be autocratic leadership styles, or it might be in the way that juniors are viewed. And perhaps it's a culture in that team that makes it permissible to interrupt junior employees. And we have a number of different root causes that we can look at, and we always work out those root causes with you and then create events from our library or use videos from our library to allow you to understand how these situations will manifest themselves in the company. Now, all of this data then needs to be analyzed, and we are using sophisticated AI to do that. So one of the things we did observe was that people's reactions actually follow patterns, often dependent on what we're looking for, but people will have very similar reactions to similar things. So what our AI is doing is using something we call a cluster analysis to understand how we can group people's experiences in distinct groups. Some people will be happy with the situation. They will perhaps be overly tolerant of what they're seeing. Other people might overreact in the other way and be hugely nervous about it and lack confidence in the company around the things that they're observing. So if we are able to take all these reactions to all these videos and actually group them into separate, distinct groups, that will give you a very clear map and understanding around what the main lived experiences are within the company relating to this, relating to the videos and relating to how people feel. And the second thing is, if you run a normal survey, those surveys are static. You always ask the same question to everyone. What our AI does is it looks at people's reactions real time and asks questions much more targeted at that individual specific situation. So we are in a much better position to ask questions that the employee feels relevant around their experience, and they feel are more important than others around what they're observing in the company. And that, of course, gives a much more granular and detailed picture of the organization. And using videos is much quicker than using a survey, written survey. Our survey will normally take 12 minutes to complete with 30 questions. And a video can reflect a lot more information than a written survey can do.
Yeah. And I think sometimes the written surveys can become confusing, and especially if it's written in a language which is not a first language. It becomes really hard, whereas the visual makes it so much easier. So I'm fascinated by the work that you're doing. I think it has huge relevance for all organizations that are going through change and transformation and turning around, really undesired behaviors. So I think that's great. Well, we're almost out of time. So Hakon, thank you for sharing your insights with us. And if I'll put some details about VorteXplore against the notes for the session today. So if people are interested, they can check out VorteXplore and what you're doing. So thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Thank you very much, Jackie. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and a very interesting topic we're talking about.
Okay. Talk soon.
Talk soon.